is Nita Couchman. I am the president of the Orcas Island Garden Club, and I want to welcome you all to our first program of this season. I'll let Lena do the introductions for Thor, but I just want to remind you all that this year's speaker schedule is posted on the Garden Club website, as well as being in the newsletter that went out yesterday. We have a lineup of exciting speakers this year that we think are going to be just great, and we hope you'll join us for those. Also, just a reminder that this is a membership renewal time. So if you haven't had a chance to renew your membership yet, you can do that online, or you can do it with the paper membership form that you got in the mail. Just go to the website of the Garden Club and you can do it all online. That's easy for you. So without further ado, I know we're all excited for this program. I'll turn the mic over to Lena to do her introductions, but thank you all for coming today.
Oh, I'm really glad to be introducing Thor again for the second time. He spoke to us last in January of 2021, so it's just a pleasure to have him back. Before I do that, I do want to go through a little housekeeping. For the best listening and viewing experience during the presentation, please keep your mic muted and turn off your personal video and select speaker view. Use the chat feature to submit comments or questions. Holly King, our esteemed librarian, will monitor chat and organize the questions and comments that you submit. And Thor will do his presentation, and then the questions and your comments will follow that. And I'm very glad to welcome you, Thor. Thor is an author and biologist. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, and I'm going to mispronounce this, I'm sorry, a Schweitzer Environmental Fellow and winner of the John Burroughs Medal. He has books including Buzz, The Triumph of Seeds, Feathers, Bartholomew Quill, The Impenetrable Forest, and Hurricane, Lizards, and Plastic Squid, which I think many of you are probably familiar with many of those books. Thor's work has been translated into more than 10 languages and earned many accolades, including the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science and 3 Pacific Northwest Book Awards. He co-hosted the PBS Nature series, American Spring Live, and has been a guest on programs ranging from Fresh Air to Science Friday, On Point, and Book Lust with Nancy Pearl. He lives with his wife and son on an island in the Pacific Northwest. We're so glad to welcome you back, Thor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me once again. It is a pleasure to join all of you on what I believe is the last day of summer. We're at a transition here. So a pleasure. And I'm going to do one of these Zoom tricks now, we call a sharing of the screen. We will hope this works. And if I go up here, I should be able to play a slideshow. Now, this is a test. You should be seeing a book cover, and then it should rapidly here turn into a polar bear.
Yes, it's working.
Excellent. Okay, we have success with the audio visual. That's half the battle. Half the battle. So thank you again for having me. I want to launch right into the presentation this morning, actually with this very image, this polar bear image, which is such a familiar, really, and iconic picture to us now. It's that polar bear stranded out there on a melting iceberg, which has really become our go-to symbol for the biological impacts of climate change. So much so that I believe the conversation far too often stops there. In the media and in all kinds of public discourse, we invoke the poor old polar bear as a dire warning, and then we move on, overlooking a rich and biological backstory that really is at the heart of all climate change scenarios. After all, what matters is not so much the change itself as the response to that change. I mean, if every species got along just as well in all conditions, then tweaking the weather this way or that wouldn't matter in the slightest. But of course, that's not how nature works. The diversity of life on Earth stems from specialization. It's this great accumulation of species that have adapted to particular environmental conditions. And when those conditions change, species react. And it is the sum of those reactions that will determine the future, theirs as well as our own. So this morning, I want to focus on the challenges that climate change creates for plants and animals, and how we can already see and measure their responses playing out all around us. We won't be talking very much about the process of climate change, the atmospheric stuff, with one notable exception: carbon dioxide. Has there ever been a substance so often invoked and so seldom explained? Now, before I began this book project, I realized that I hardly knew anything about the stuff that was making the planet warm in the first place. I mean, I do remember my high school, chemistry textbook where CO2 was depicted like this, as a large black ball, the carbon atom, bookended by two smallish red ones, the oxygen atoms. Now, at the time, I recall thinking that it looked just like the face of the red-eyed fruit flies that we'd spent the entire previous semester studying in the biology class. Now, that association stuck with me, and later, when the link between climate change and carbon dioxide became notorious, I found myself imagining the world's tailpipes and smokestacks spewing forth this endless swarm of tiny flies. Now, it was a vivid image, certainly, but not very helpful, really, in explaining and understanding the situation. Because carbon dioxide is paradoxical. It's a global threat, but it also happens to be one of the building blocks of life on Earth. It's everywhere, which may explain why it was the first atmospheric gas ever to be identified. In fact, before the discovery of carbon dioxide, scientists weren't sure exactly what the atmosphere was or whether or not it contained anything measurable at all. Now, credit for the discovery of carbon dioxide and much of the early work on that gas goes in large part, really, to this fellow here, Joseph Priestley. He was an 18th century clergyman. He was a chemist. He was a good friend of Benjamin Franklin's. He was an all-around polymath. And Priestley, in turn, he credits his discovery to the fact that he was, quote, living for some time in the neighborhood of a public brewery. And there he found quantities of this colorless and odorless gas collecting above the fermentation vats. And he also found brewers who were patient enough to allow him to build a scaffold over the top of those vats and then start lowering in all manner of experiments into that invisible cloud. He learned that this stuff would snuff out a candle flame, and he knew that whatever it was heavy, because he could see it carrying the smoke down towards the brewery floor. He saw that small animals and insects could not breathe this gas, and he found that he could dissolve it in water, producing a fizzy beverage which had a, quote, pleasant acidulous taste. Now that breakthrough earned him the prestigious Copley Medal from the Fellows of the Royal Society of London, but it earned a lot more for entrepreneur Johann Schwepp, who copied Priestley's methods. He read the papers. Priestley published this stuff. Schwepp copied those methods to found the tonic and soda water company that still bears his name. Now, Priestley's work paved the way for a lot of other experiments. Scientists soon learned that carbon dioxide retained heat. And as early as the 1890s, they predicted that industrial activities were adding it to the atmosphere in quantities large enough to warm the planet. In the 1890s. Now, of course, this work was done in Sweden, where the idea of warming the planet by a few degrees was generally greeted with gusto. So we've learned and known for a long time about carbon dioxide and how it was a greenhouse gas. But that still doesn't explain why some carbon dioxide is bad and some of it is benign. And to get my head around that distinction, I had to get my hands on some CO2. So I conducted a little experiment at home with my son Noah on various contents of our refrigerator. And I'd like to share that story with you now, straight out of the book. This comes from the second chapter of the book, and it begins with a quotation that is attributed by his biographer to Galileo, who said, "We must measure all that is measurable and strive to make measurable all that is not." It turns out that fermentation occurs in a lot more places than vats of beer. Yogurt and cheese makers call it culturing, but it's more accurate to think of it as a form of slow microbial digestion, a way for bacteria and other tiny organisms to extract and use energy from the foods they live within and around. Like any form of digestion, it is a process that produces waste. Luckily for food lovers, the byproducts of fermentation include things like alcohol, thus the beer, and lactic acid, which adds tanginess and pungency to such cultured favorites as kimchi and buttermilk. Most fermentation also produces carbon dioxide, which is what had me combing through the back reaches of our refrigerator. A container of organic sauerkraut advertised probiotic punch and claimed it's alive. But any organisms that the kraut might have once contained had long since shuffled off their mortal coils and were no longer producing carbon dioxide. A lit match held above that briny mix burned brightly. Experiments with yogurt and sour cream were similarly disappointing, but then we hit the jackpot. On the bottom shelf, behind the bags of carrots and celery, sat a half-gallon jar of homemade pickles. They had been stewing in their own juices since August, and they tasted yeasty as well as sour, suggesting that fungi had joined the bacteria in their digestive pursuits. Frankly, it was past time, far past time, to throw those pickles out. But for once, procrastinating a chore had paid off. As soon as Noah and I brought a match near that open lid, the flame demonstrated why carbon dioxide is such a common ingredient in fire extinguishers. With no oxygen to burn, the match went out in an instant, as if we'd turned off a switch. What's more, the smoke from the snuffed tip curled downward, trapped in the gas, just as Priestley had described. "It's pouring down the side," Noah exclaimed, watching as wisps of smoke followed the heavy vapors over the jar rim and down to spread across the countertop. "That's it," I told him. "You saw the carbon dioxide." He quickly brought me back to earth, reminding me that our quarry was invisible. "I didn't see the carbon dioxide, Papa. I saw the smoke." But like Priestley before us, we could use that smoke to watch the gas, defining its boundaries as it flowed and swirled around the open jar. For a few minutes, our kitchen was filled with the thrill of discovery as we lit match after match, watching them snuff and smolder until all the carbon dioxide had dissipated into the surrounding air. Simple experiments often lead to broader insights, and repeating Priestley's fermentation trick brought up an obvious question. Do pickles cause climate change? Does making beer? The answer, of course, is no. But understanding why some carbon emissions are harmless and while others are not reveals a basic truth about climate change that we rarely stop to think about. In the case of our pickle jar, the carbon came from the cucumbers in the brine, and the cucumbers had gotten it from the air around our garden the previous summer. Like plants everywhere, their growth relied upon photosynthesis, that leafy process of combining carbon dioxide and water with energy from the sun to create starches. In other words, carbon dioxide puts the carbo in carbohydrates. When those starches break down, the carbon dioxide goes back into the atmosphere. This is the step in the Earth's carbon cycle that we are most familiar with, because we play a role in it every moment of every day. Whether we eat plants or eat animals that have eaten plants, the energy that fuels our bodies traces right back to those photosynthetic starches, and we release carbon dioxide with every exhaled breath. But in terms of climate change, breathing is like making pickles or brewing beer, guilt-free. That's because our bodies are just one short stop for carbon on its continuous circuit from the air through plants and animals and back again, with no net gain or loss. If that's all there was to the story, then the planet wouldn't be warming, and I wouldn't be giving this lecture. The reality of modern climate change hinges on one key fact. Not all plants break down. Consider the pickle. Cucumbers, eaten fresh or left to rot in the garden compost, release their carbon right away. But the process slows down considerably in a jar of salty brine. Under the right conditions, it can stop altogether. In nature, this occurs primarily in two locations, the ocean floor and boggy wetlands. When marine algae die en masse and sink to the seabed, they sometimes get buried before they are eaten or decomposed. Dead plants in bogs can also accumulate with little decay, forming layer upon layer of peat. In either case, if sedimentary rocks develop above and around those organic deposits, their carbon is effectively trapped, removed from the atmosphere for millions of years. Transformed by heat and pressure and age, we recognize these ancient plants as the fossil fuels. Petroleum from the algae, coal from the peat, and natural gas, which can come from either. So burning those fossil fuels now returns all of that stockpiled carbon dioxide to the air at once, overwhelming the natural cycle and leading to the many consequences now unfolding. So the next time you find something at the back of the fridge that looks like a scientific experiment, it is a scientific experiment. There's a lot to be learned there, and it's a good reminder that even the atmospheric aspects of modern climate change are really rooted in biology. So we know that the climate is warming and we know why, but what does that mean for plants and animals? As you can imagine, this is now a booming field of scientific study. Climate impacts are so widespread in nature that it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that all biologists are studying climate change. Some of them just don't know it yet. Now, it helps to organize this deluge of information into themes. And one of the most common themes in climate change biology has to do with timing. At Walden Pond, the violets and wood sorrel that Henry David Thoreau admired in May and June now bloom in late April. And what he called, quote, that early yellow smell of willows can reliably be savored in March. Spring is arriving earlier and earlier. You can see it happen in your own backyard. And if you write your observations down, as Thoreau did, they might one day become valuable. His meticulous notes on the plants and birds at Walden are now a vital baseline for modern comparisons. One expert told me that if Thoreau was listed as a co-author on all of the papers now using his data, he would be one of the most prolific climate change scientists of the 21st century. But a modern spring isn't just earlier than what Thoreau saw, it's different. To Thoreau, it might seem like a season in disarray. That's because not all species are responding in the same ways to climate change. They're not even responding at the same times. This flower now will be familiar to many of you. It is a familiar spring site in meadows throughout the San Juan Islands. This is known as death camas. Like many plants, it produces toxins to ward off would-be attackers. But unlike most other plants, it doesn't just put those chemicals into its leaves or seeds or other places that are likely to be nibbled by an herbivore. It puts them everywhere, including in its pollen and in its nectar. Now, what's more, the main toxin in the mix, zygacine, is especially nasty stuff. It attacks the heart, it attacks the lungs, and for good measure, it attacks the digestive tract. So you'll have an upset stomach while you perish. So its Latin name really says it all. It's called Toxicoscordion venenosum venenosum, which translates to poisonous bulb, poisonous, poisonous. So we know that death camas is well protected, but in terms of pollination, that puts it really in kind of a bind. It's a tough position. How do you attract insects to your flowers when instead of a tasty reward, you are offering them seizures, paralysis, and death? enter the appropriately named death camas bee, one of only a handful of species of insects and the only bee that has figured out a way to either tolerate or even detoxify death camas poison. Now that gives the bee an exclusive source of pollen and nectar in springtime, and it gives the flower a dedicated pollinator. It's a very tight and very specialized co-evolved relationship. But in many locations, death camas now blooms weeks earlier than it did just 30 years ago. On Yellow Island here in the San Juans, for example, it's 2 weeks earlier than it was in the 1980s. It's responding, of course, to the steady rise that we see in springtime air temperatures. But the bee, on the other hand, is still on the old schedule because it nests below the ground, and soil warms much more slowly than air. So if that trend continues, we could see what biologists call a timing mismatch, where different responses at different rates threaten to separate or decouple the partners in this critical ecological relationship. The flowers will be too early for their bee, and the bee will be too late for its flower. They still overlap now, but the period of overlap is getting shorter and shorter as our springs warm. So specialized relationships like pollination are particularly vulnerable to timing problems. But mismatches are cropping up all over the place, from migrating caribou, which in some cases now are arriving at their calving grounds too late for the peak in the productivity of the tundra plants that they feed upon, to migrating shorebirds missing out on the peak productivity of the various intertidal organisms and worms and crustaceans and so forth that they feed upon to fuel their journey. Now, it can take years or decades to really tease apart these relationships and to really understand the long-term impacts of what's going on with timing problems. There are other climate change challenges that are much more immediate and more direct. Extremes, for example, the increasingly harsh climatic conditions that we are all becoming more and more familiar with, that simply push species beyond their comfort zones. The storms, the floods, the droughts, the heat domes. As one expert told me, it's pretty simple. Sometimes organisms just get too hot. And one such example comes to us from the deserts of the American Southwest, where you might expect creatures to be well prepared for a warmer world. They're living in the hottest place in North America. Yet they're facing challenges. Now, this story comes to us from Barry Sinervo, who is a herpetologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, but who as an undergraduate spent time here in the San Juans at the Friday Harbor Labs. At any rate, now Barry studies lizards, including this one, the western fence lizard, a species that if your childhood was anything like mine, you might have tried and failed to catch. They always scurried away at the last moment to hide under a nearby rock. Well, it turns out that fence lizards use rocks for a lot more than escaping young lizard enthusiasts. They are what scientists call heliotherms. They use the sun to regulate their body temperature, basking on top of rocks to warm up, and then retreating underneath rocks to cool down again. They can't stay out in the sun indefinitely because their bodies can't compensate. They don't have a physiological way to cool down rather than using the shade. So if they stay out in the sun, they would overheat and ultimately perish. So as temperatures have risen, particularly in these deserts and other prime reptile habitats, the lizards have done what they've always done on hot days. They've spent more time in the shade. But that comes at a cost. Time devoted to hiding under rocks means less time spent out looking for food. So as temperatures rise, their daily calorie intake starts going down. Barry and his crew watched a number of populations wink out before realizing that it wasn't the heat killing the lizards directly. Instead, they were spending so much time in the shade that the females weren't eating enough to build up the energy reserves required to reproduce. In other words, when it gets too hot, the lizards stop breeding. And it doesn't take a PhD in herpetology to predict long-term consequences of that. Now, another climate change challenge for plants and animals has to do with what fans of the Jungle Book might call the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities of life. What happens when some critical element of a species' habitat just disappears? Now, the melting pack ice up in the Arctic is an example of that. What we started off with the polar bears and also the seals, of course, who rely upon that ice as a critical part of their habitat. For the bears, when the ice is gone, they no longer have the place they prefer to hunt for these seals that make up an important part of their diet. But if we could look beyond the bears and the seals to the edge of that pack ice, we might see another species that is threatened, a tiny seabird called the little auk or dovekie that feeds in the plankton-rich waters right along the edges of those ice floes. Now, that strategy worked well for the dovekie until the ice began to dwindle and retreat from places like Franz Josef Land, an archipelago in the Russian Arctic, where the dovekies breed. Now, scientists had long predicted that dovekies would be an early casualty of climate change because as the ice retreated, they would have to fly farther and farther to find food to bring back to their nests to feed to their chicks. And eventually that distance would become too great. The chicks would starve, the breeding season would fail, and the population would collapse. But that brings us to a really important point. And the point is this: nature is not defenseless. Nature is not a passive bystander to global warming. When the climate changes, species react, sometimes in ways that we would never guess. So let us catch up then with the story of the dovekies, again, straight out of the book. This is from a conversation with a marvelous French scientist named David Gremillet, who participated in an expedition to a remote dovekie breeding colony in Franz Josef Land. We had indeed strong hypotheses and predictions on how they would behave, Gremillet explained, noting that birds in their previous studies had regularly flown over 60 miles to reach the edge of the pack ice. We were expecting flight times between the colony and the foraging spot of at least an hour, he went on, and then recounted what he called, quote, one of the most exciting moments of my research career. Sitting with their laptops at the dinner table, surrounded by their Russian counterparts in the research station, they opened up the first batch of tracking data and saw precisely how long the birds had been in the air. Less than 4 minutes. Instead of trekking all the way to the edge of the sea ice, the dovekies had apparently found an alternative food source right on their doorstep. But what and where? It's easy to imagine the excited conjecture and conversation that came next, perhaps fortified by a sip or two of vodka. Soon their ideas began to coalesce around an entirely new hypothesis. My colleague, Jérôme Fort, remembered what we had seen while climbing the nearby mountain with our Russian friends a week before, Gremillet recalled, and he described a distinct line across the mouth of the fjord where the cloudy blue water from the melting glaciers on the island slammed into the dark, dense currents of the Arctic Ocean. Both Fort and Gremillet had trained as oceanographers before they began studying birds, so they understood the consequences of such an abrupt transition. We both knew what this front meant, a curtain of plankton killed by temperature and osmotic shock. For tiny crustaceans, swimming so suddenly from one kind of water into another was like driving full speed into a wall. And for anything that fed upon those crustaceans, the resulting pileup created a bonanza. Testing their theory required a boat, but the only craft available was a, quote, chronically deflated dinghy. And the fuel they'd brought from Murmansk turned out to be contaminated with water. None of this was exactly ideal for exploring a polar sea, but they set off anyway and managed to sputter far enough out into the fjord for a survey. There wasn't much to see at first, but as they crossed the convergence between the glacial meltwater and the ocean water, the dovekies were suddenly all around them. The little auks were all there, Gremillet told me, aligned on the oceanic side, diving and stuffing themselves on plankton, easily picked from an underwater curtain. With that revelation, the story of dovekies and climate change switched instantly from one of decline to one of resilience. Yes, the sea ice was melting as predicted, but so were Arctic glaciers. And in places like Franz Josef Land, where those glaciers are plentiful, that created an opportunity that no one saw coming. Gremillet and his team spent the remainder of their field season showing that dovekies weren't just surviving on their new food source, they were thriving. Chicks grew at precisely the same rate as they had on a traditional diet, measured decades earlier at the same location. To Gremillet, the project demonstrated how one overlooked detail can have a huge effect on the outcome. Even if you think you know, he summarized, you really have to get out into the field to check what wild creatures are doing, because they very often surprise you. David Gremillet's story embodies something I heard again and again during my research for this book, how scientists went into the field expecting to study one thing and ended up studying something else, because conditions on the ground were so different from what they expected, different in terms of the climate and different in terms of the lives and the activities of their subjects. The dovekies were able to pivot quickly to a new food source because they have what scientists call plasticity. It's something kind of like Plastic Man, if you remember the old comic book character. They are inherently flexible, with a built-in ability to stretch themselves and find ways to adapt. Now, in an era of rapid change, plasticity allows a rapid response. And for some species, it applies to a lot more than how they behave. The Humboldt squid, for example, virtually disappeared from traditional fishing grounds in Mexico's Gulf of California after a series of climate-driven marine heat waves. Or so everybody thought, until surveys found that the squid were not only still present, but in some locations they were more abundant than ever. Instead of departing, they had responded to heat stress by adopting a radically different life strategy. They matured and reproduced in half the time. They ate different foods. They also lived only half as long. And under those constraints, their new adult bodies could reach only a fraction of their former size, too small to bite on the lures that had previously been used to catch them. Their rapid downsizing fooled the fishers, who had been dismissing the few they could hook as juveniles or another species altogether. You can see the difference in this slide, the old style adult Humboldt squid at the top, and the young, or the new adult squid there after the marine heat waves at the bottom. They look completely different in size, strikingly different. So most climate change responses measured to date have been the result of plasticity, capabilities that were already baked into a species' genetic makeup, like the squid or like the dovekey, changing their bodies or changing their behaviors very quickly based on capabilities they already have. But in some tantalizing cases, there are now signs of climate-driven evolution in action. And one of the best examples comes to us from another lizard. This is a small lizard native to the Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean. Colin Donahue, now at Washington University, but at that point he was a graduate student, or a postdoc, I think. He had just arrived to study the lizard population as part of a study on the impacts of non-native rats. The idea was they would go out and measure all the native flora and fauna and then remove the Norway rats and then see how the native species responded in the aftermath. But then a hurricane struck and his research took an unexpected turn. So let's pick up the story straight out of chapter 8, which begins with a quotation from Giuseppe Lampedusa's novel, The Leopard, where he wrote, "If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change." Actually, it was 2 hurricanes, Donahue clarified, when I called to ask him how the story played out. Hurricane Irma struck first, pummeling the eastern Caribbean with torrential rains, storm surge, and Category 5 winds exceeding 175 miles per hour. Just 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria swept through with similar force. The combined storms devastated low-lying islands, like the ones where Donahue's lizards lived, uprooting trees, flattening structures, and leaving both natural and human communities reeling. Needless to say, researchers put the rat project on an indefinite hold. But for Donahue, that setback also offered an opportunity. While his questions about lizards and rats would have to wait, he was now in the perfect position to study the effects of hurricanes. Had any lizards survived? And if so, was that surviving population measurably different from the one he'd just studied? We had no idea what to expect, he told me, but I knew we weren't going to get another chance at that kind of data. So he cobbled together some funding, headed back to the Caribbean, and found himself in a sort of scientific deja vu, repeating the exact same field experiment he had just completed 6 weeks earlier. We were on a short timeline, so it was pretty much catching and measuring lizards all day long, Donahue recalled, but he described the trip with obvious pleasure, as if this were precisely how anyone would want to spend their time on a tropical island. In conversation, Donahue's enthusiasm for science borders on exuberance. He comes across as someone who probably keeps working and thinking long after other people might quit for the day and retire to the poolside bar. That may be why he recognized the potential value of returning so soon to resurvey his lizards. And it's almost certainly why it occurred to him to bring along a leaf blower. The customs officer was very confused, he said, and laughed out loud at the memory of trying to explain the science behind traveling with a large piece of landscaping equipment. We needed to know how the lizards behaved in hurricane-force winds, he told me. It was entirely possible they might just run for it or hunker down in the tree roots. We didn't know. And since watching lizards in a real hurricane was out of the question, Donahue used the leaf blower to simulate one on the porch outside his hotel room. Now, I have to say, I wonder what the people in the next room thought about that. It's one thing if someone leaves the TV on kind of loud, but a leaf blower. At any rate, Colin was kind enough to share with me a video of that experiment so we can all see what he saw. But before I play it, let me assure you that no lizards were harmed. There is a soft net just off camera, and all the lizards were caught and safely returned to the wild moments after the experiment. So without further ado, then I give you the hurricane lizard. As the wind begins, you can see the back legs slipping off. Now the full body flapping like a flag in the wind as it increases to hurricane force until finally it's too strong, and the lizard falls from the stick. So now, in addition to getting quite a few hits on YouTube when he put it up there, this video perfectly explained what Colin had seen in his data, because the post-hurricane lizard population was different. The surviving lizards were the ones that had the largest toe pads and the strongest front legs, large, strong front legs and large toe pads for holding on tight to branches during the storm. But they also had shorter back legs, which he didn't understand until he saw the video and realized that short back legs reduce the drag on the body, allowing the lizards to cling to the stick for just a few seconds longer, which in the middle of a hurricane can be the difference between life and death. So in other words, it was survival of the fittest in action. And later surveys showed that those traits were being passed down to the next generations. The lizards were evolving in response to climate change, not over the course of centuries or thousands of years, but really within the space of a single field season. So climate change biology is full of those kinds of surprises. And I hope you will agree with me that there's a lot more to it than a polar bear on an iceberg. Now, this morning, we have been talking about timing mismatches and extreme weather, plasticity, evolution, and I have to tell you, we haven't even scratched the surface. Consider movement, one of the primary responses to climate change. Between 25 and 85% of species on the planet are shifting their ranges in response to this crisis, fanning out across continents and oceans in search of the temperatures and other conditions that they're used to. Now, even at the low end of that estimate, that's a quarter of all life on Earth. So climate-driven upheavals are impacting all kinds of fundamental ecological processes, from competition to predation, hybridization, parasitism, and yes, also extinction. The mouse-like bramblecea melomes in Australia recently became the first mammal species confirmed as a climate change casualty when all of its known habitat was inundated by rising sea levels. So studying climate change doesn't make scientists worry less about this crisis, but it can help us to worry smart, allocating scarce resources to the species that need our help the most. Now that's important on a personal level as well, as we all struggle to allocate our limited emotional capital to this crisis. We need to know what to worry about. So yes, climate change is daunting, but I argue that it deserves our curiosity as well as our concern. Because after all, it is hard to solve a problem if we aren't even interested in it. Now, in a moment, I want to take some questions, and I hope you have some. But let me end with a short passage from the conclusion to the book, which begins with an epigraph from Shakespeare's King John. Strong reasons make strong actions. I subscribe to a philosophy expressed to me by Gordon Orions, an eminent American biologist whose 7-decade career has spanned everything from blackbird behavior to the evolution of fear. When asked what a concerned citizen should do to combat climate change, his response was immediate and concise: everything you can. In that simple phrase, Orions managed to capture both urgency and agency, the seriousness of the issue combined with the importance of taking action at a relevant scale. It's not a new idea. 19th century thinker Edward Everett Hale expressed something similar in a verse conceived long before anyone was worried about their carbon footprint. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something, he wrote. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do. The value of the advice from both Orions and Hale lies in their choice of the word can, a verb rooted in possibility and adaptable to any circumstance. It helps us to focus our energy on tasks immediately at hand. Tangible things like how we drive, shop, eat, travel, protest, vote, even cut the grass. Naysayers will claim that taking personal action is trivial, that it's an empty gesture in the face of a problem so large. But that position is wrong. And it's not just slightly wrong, it is the opposite of the truth. In nature, we have seen how the responses of individual organisms determine the fates of populations, species, and entire ecological communities. The same pattern applies to society. Addressing climate change requires a fundamental cultural shift in our relationship with energy, from how we produce it to how much of it our lifestyles demand. That makes individual action more important, not less so, because it is the collective behaviors of individuals that define and change a culture. Yes, we need stronger climate policies and strong leadership to carry them forward, but those things will be and are being they are the results of cultural change, not the cause of it. So doing everything one can about climate change is also a fitting approach biologically because it is precisely what plants and animals are doing. Their responses are playing out all around us every day, a constant thrumming call to action. Because in spite of the complexity of our societies and the technologies that we surround ourselves with, in the end, we're just one more species on a changing world, facing the same climate challenges and drawing on the same basic toolbox of potential solutions, with one notable difference. Unlike any other organism on the planet, people have the ability to do more than simply react to climate change. If we so choose, we can alter the behaviors that are causing it to happen. Thank you for your attention. With that, I'm going to stop the screen share and invite any questions that you may have, climate change or otherwise, this morning that I can help you with.
Thor, I don't have any in the chat. This is Holly. I don't
Oh,
have
hi,
any in the
Holly.
chat. Hi. Are you comfortable opening it up for people just to unmute themselves and ask?
Whatever works for you guys. I'm happy
Okay.
with that.
I have a question. This is Laura Walker.
Go ahead, Laura.
So, first off, thank you so much for your presentation. It's very inspiring. And it's a reality that I think it's very important for us as gardeners to consider. But just like animals, it seems like plants need to adapt as well. And my question to you is, what can we do as home gardeners to help our plants adapt to their new environment? And secondly, should we be planting different plants that might thrive as our climate locally starts to change?
Oh, it's such a good question, and so many possibilities in the response. But I think you will already, if you think back on your lifetime or experience gardening, start to notice some of the changes in terms of when things get planted, when you start to water, all of these things that we do sort of unconsciously, responding to the plants that we're attending and caring for. We see what they need and we provide it. But if we were like Henry David Thoreau and had been writing down all the notes on everything that we did every day, we would probably be seeing great changes in the timing of those activities, because as we see here in the San Juans, we have earlier spring times, and then we have what is expected now to continue, this long summer drought. We're still at the end of it. It's been weeks and weeks and weeks since a drop of rain. And I think for many of us who have been here for a long time, decades ago, there were always, as a school kid growing up in this region, weeks of the summer where it was a real drag because it rained the whole time. And my child has not had that experience. The summers now are very dry. So I think we're already adapting in how we care for the plants in our gardens. And I think that will continue. We need to be watering more. Summertime, we have different planting schedules in the spring, and so on and so forth. And the second half of your question, or the second question, is a fascinating one as well. And I think more and more the answer is yes. We're beginning now to see, that we can plant and get a crop out of different things than we might have in decades past. My son, for example, just delivered about 30 or 40 pounds of melons to our local co-op. His annual melon crop came ripe this week, finally. And I don't think there were a lot of people probably growing melons successfully in the islands 40 years ago. So we see the difference in what we can grow based on the difference in the climate. And that has repercussions really globally. But one of my favorite stories about that is a story about seeds, actually, and a conversation that I had with the director of our National Seed Bank in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is a fabulous facility, and she's a marvelous scientist and wonderful person. They're looking after over 1 billion seeds in that seed collection there. It's truly remarkable. And when we started talking about climate change, she looked at me and she said, sorghum. And I said, what? She said, sorghum. That's our response to climate change. She said, we have over 40,000 different varieties of sorghum in the collection, because sorghum is the hot season grain. Sorghum is adapted to hot, dry conditions. That is what we expect more and more of in North America. And she said, we need to be prepared for a farming system that's much more based on sorghum in the decades ahead. They're already thinking about it and storing up varieties from around the world. So we'll be doing that sort of thing at a small scale in our own backyards.
Thank you.
You bet.
This is Lina.
Hi,
I have a
go
question
ahead.
that sort of puts together your two books, or two of your books, Buzz and then What's Happening with Climate Change. In the 15 years that I've been coming to the islands, and particularly most dramatically this spring, I've been seeing fewer and fewer bees. And this spring, bushes, my snowberry bushes that I expect to be being really noisy was buzzing and things were much quieter than they usually are. Do you have thoughts about what we can do or what we should be doing to help those bees? My explanation, which may be completely incorrect, but based on what I've seen, was that it partly had to do with the winter being so cold and then warming up and getting cold again, and also with periods of extreme wet. And I was thinking about what happens with ground nesting or overwintering bees. But I don't have an answer to what I can do except leave lots of mess to help those bees in the coming years. And I wondered if you had some suggestions.
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. And bees are very dear to my heart, as I think all gardeners love bees. One has to. Marvelous creatures that they are. And so there are sort of two aspects or two ways to look at these bee trends. And there are short-term factors, and then there are long-term factors. And I think the paucity of bees that we saw this summer is the result of a combination, but mostly a short-term trend. And that was that long, cool springtime that we saw. We had a fairly harsh winter, but then it was really that long, wet, cold spring that lasted on and on through a period of time when many of our native bees were going through their entire life cycle, and when some of them, the longer lived species and those that have colonies that last, your bumblebees and so on, would have been establishing a lot of those colonies that would have been then thriving through the summer months. They couldn't get a good start because of the cool weather. The cold limited what they could forage for, kept them in their nests and in their holes. And then the wet itself is problematic for bees in that it can straight out drown them in some cases, but also it leads to fungal infections, which is one of the real threats to bees over the course of their winter and spring before they emerge. So those two things really knocked the bees back in this region as a result of that short-term weather trend. What we then saw later in the summer, in fact, we just have seen the end of it now in our garden, is the bees that were able to establish we had a colony of the yellow-faced bumblebee, one I'm sure you're all familiar, that big black one with the yellow stripe on the abdomen and the beautiful yellow face, Bombus vosnesenskii, for those concerned with such things. Actually, at the end of the season now, has had an incredible run in our garden. They're just everywhere, and the queens they are producing are absolutely mammoth because they've had such a lack of competition. The flowers are basically all theirs. Which brings up the point that there is some natural resilience in bee populations and insects in general. When they get good conditions, they can really take off. So we can be hopeful that future years will be better than what we saw this year for a range of bee species. So those are responses to short-term trends, short-term weather patterns. In some ways, the larger concern are the longer-term trends that we have seen in reduction in bee numbers. And a lot of it is still anecdotal. We don't have great data on a lot of insect populations. So there's a lot more effort now going into trying to get that sort of long-term data on native bees. But where people have looked at it, oftentimes they've been able to track long-term declines. A lot of that has to do with habitat. The loss of habitat. It has to do with the rampant use of pesticides, the change in rural landscapes, not so much here in the islands, but in farming areas where we've gone from smaller family farms to industrial style agriculture, farmed road to road without hedgerows, without fallow areas and backyard gardens and so forth. So that the amount of bee habitat is simply decreased, and there are a lot more chemicals that they have to face. And then also there's more concern too about the responses to climate change on the part of bees, in that they're vulnerable to heat stress. And we've seen more of that in these heat dome events. they are vulnerable to extremes in weather and all sorts of things. Storms can wipe out populations, all of these sorts of things. So that has yet to be fully understood. Of course, it's all still playing out, but it's those longer term insect trends that people are really focused on right now, trying to understand and reverse, because short-term insect trends are not uncommon. They're very, insect population can respond to very local conditions up and down year to year. So it's really those longer term trends that we really want to try to reverse. And as individuals, what we can do is focus on the habitat that we have at hand, our yards and gardens, pesticide free, with a variety of flowers over the course of the flowering period from spring all the way through the fall, with as many native, local or regional native plants as possible. There are non-natives that also provide good habitat, but any amount of native plants you can include in your landscaping and gardening will increase the diversity of bees. It's an absolute lock. And not only diversity of bees, but diversity of a whole range of other insects that have co-evolved with those plants and that will use them in ways that they never would use a non-native they're not familiar with. So doing what we can to make our own habitat better, and then making choices in terms of how we shop, in terms of our lifestyles, in terms of how we vote, to try to steer the whole system at a larger scale towards a more bee-friendly and environment. That has everything to do with everything from climate change policy all the way down to agriculture and to things like bee-friendly products, which now there's a Bee Smart label that you can look for on certain farming products, where that the farms from which they come have been labeled as bee-friendly farms.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Other questions out there that I can help you with? Everyone's eager to go to lunch.
Well, hearing none, if there's someone who wants to, this is last call. Okay. I'm having trouble changing my screen to show my face, so not sure. Oh, there I succeeded. The right touch. Thor, thank you very much. Really appreciate this, and that you were willing to spend more time with us today and to change things. We had hoped that Thor would be meeting with us in person and that there would be representatives from the library and from Darville's bookstore here and with us in person. There are books available at the library, and they're also available at Darville's bookstore if you're interested in more of the richness that and information that those books have to offer. And Thor, thank you again. Nita, I think we'll just wrap up for us then. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks to all of you.
Great. What a great program. Thank you so much, Thor. Thank you, library. Thank you, Holly, for hosting this for us. Thank you all for coming. Our next program will be in the middle of October. You'll get notices about that in your newsletter and in upcoming emails. So we'll hope you'll join us for next month's program. And as Lena said, Thor's books are available at Darville's. They're also available here at the public library. So there's lots to think about and things that we can do, which is hopeful for thinking about what we're all facing ahead in the future. So with that, we'll close our meeting, and thank you all for coming. Thank you, Thor, and we'll see you next month.
See you next time.
Okay.